A common struggle that we producers face is that we oftentimes don't know how to take an 8-bar loop, an idea that we really like or we put emotion and heart into, and turn that into a full track, a full story, a full arranged piece of music. I've spent the last 2 weeks just arranging loops that I have on my hard drive, and I came up with a particular strategy called the cooldown and warm-up arrangement. And to make things a bit more easier to understand, I prepared a little chart, and I'm going to dive deep into a project that I've already finished, so you get to see what exactly I'm talking about. So let's dive in. This is my track Crossing Worlds that I finished recently. You can see that I've prepared a couple locators, aka notes, which indicate what current part of the arrangement is happening. So while this track plays, I'm going to open up the chart, and with my mouse I will indicate what exactly is going on. For example, let's start playing from the cooldown section here where it cools down. Atmosphere's coming in. Drums going away. Less definition in the low end now. Now we're in the break. All in on the atmospheres, textures, nature sounds. There's no drums. Take your time here. Now comes the build. Have at least one element that opens up. It's this one here. Now comes the warm-up. Bass is being teased. It's a lot of delay, feedback, some atmospheres. Drums start coming in. Still a few atmospheric samples in the background. Tension. Something's happening. And we're back on the drop. Bring back all the drums. Bassline all in. Yeah. The reason why we create these cooldown and warm-up phases before we transition into the break and from the break into the drop, we extend the arrangement. Look at how many bars we have here. 16 bars, 16 bars, 16 bars, 16 bars. You really get to space out your track this way. And for example, I'm going to delete the cooldown section of my track here. I think the command would be Command-Shift-Delete, and it'll move along everything else. And I'm going to delete the warm-up section here. So let's highlight the warm-up section and Command-Shift-Delete. This is how it sounds like. A bit more sudden. It works, but something's just missing. And for example, if I move from the break/build straight into the main section or the drop, this is how it sounds like. I mean, it could work potentially if you adjust the automation a bit, but in my opinion, if you create that 16-bar space before and after the breakdown and build-up section here, you get a lot more of a longer arrangement in those 16 bars. You get to play with automation, you get to blend in elements over a longer period of time or blend them back out. And I've taken a couple notes on things that just work in these particular sections. Feel free to take a screenshot or copy this and apply it to your own arrangements. So I'm going to add in these cooldown and warm-up sections and just quickly illustrate what's going on inside the session now. If we take the chart again, you see in the cooldown section, we're filtering down the drums using a low-pass filter. A low-pass filter just lets the low end pass, taking away all the high-end frequencies. If you take a look on my drum bus without the kick here, drum bus NK, drum bus no kick, there's an auto filter taking away the high frequencies slowly, reducing the amount of energy you have in the drums. You can see that here. Slowly taking away the power in the drums. And while that's happening, you're also getting a reverb automation, contributing to this whole new space that we're creating. I mean, isn't it beautiful to have just that alone before the breakdown happens? A phase where you get to really take your time to blend out the drums rather than just cutting them down all of a sudden and just adding some kind of white noise transition sweep to compensate for that. So having a 16-bar transitional phase called the cooldown to really take your time to filter down the drums and blend in some type of automation. It doesn't need to be reverb. I find that Valhalla Frequency Echo, for example, is a great plugin that you can put on one of your sends. These are the send tracks, and you can see H is black hole reverb. It's a very nice large reverb space that I use for automation. Alternatively, again, you could use some creative effects like Valhalla Frequency Echo or Artuya EFX fragments and do some weird fragmentation before the breakdown hits. Having a cooldown allows you 16 bars of space to get creative with all your individual elements. So this is what I do with the drums. And the bass over here, the bass line, you see there's a couple layers to it, mainly consisting of the hip hop sub bass and the rhythmic bass over here. I found that this rhythmic bass was a bit too clicky, so I reduced the amount of energy it had in the high end using an auto filter as well. And again, 16 bars of that. So we're just gradually taking out the energy. Alternatively, you could also change this auto filter into high pass mode, meaning that you could just create an automation in the opposite direction, basically just taking away the bass before the breakdown hits. That also works. But this is just a trial and error thing. I figured that this worked quite well for this particular track. Just try to reduce the amount of weight that you have in the low end before bringing in that breakdown. And again, there's multiple approaches to this. You can either just completely blend out the bass, which works sometimes, but having a cooldown section, which allows you to just gradually blend out the bass, reduce its weight, helps as well. And in the cooldown section, you also see that you get to slowly blend in your atmospheres and textures. And you see that's what I've done with these pads over here. I slowly start blending them in. Especially this chord progression pad, which is a sample that contains a chord progression. By clicking the auto filter and heading into automation mode, you see that I slowly blend that in the cooldown section here. So ironically, it's called cooldown, but that's the phase where we slowly introduce the atmospheres, because in the breakdown, that's usually where we want to have like all the atmospheres, all the textures, completely different space. So if I were telling a story, for example, the breakdown would be the outer space and the cooldown would be the lift off from Earth. Does that make sense? Yeah, man. We're slowly lifting off here, and breakdown is when we're in outer space. Pay attention to how this chord progression blends in. Beautiful. And then breakdown. All in. That's usually where you put in all of the melodic elements of your track at once. And that's exactly what I've noted down here. So the break, all in on the atmospheres, pads, atmospheres, textures, chord progressions, nature sounds, effects and textures. Ideally, this is the phase where you don't want any drums. This also, again, depends on what type of style you're going for. I know a lot of producers who leave in some rhythmic elements during the break to make it feel at least a bit danceable. But in the case of this track, I wanted to have a completely different space in the breakdown and create some new type of atmosphere. In case you're wondering why the chord progression pad is off here, it's because this was a trial and error type thing. I actually enjoyed having this call and response. So this is like the call and this is the response where every other atmosphere plays besides this little chord progression. And this again gives me the space to introduce the chord progression during the build-up phase. And the chord progression is usually the element that allows you to open up something. Some type of chord progression element or synth that you can open up fully to create tension is what you want in this build-up section over here. That's exactly what I've noted here. Have at least one element or synth that opens up. Best way to do this is to use automation. Cutoff filter automation, filter decay, or release. And if you want, you could also introduce some kind of a riser or snare build. So what you could alternatively do is, instead of using a sample that already has like a built-in filter sweep, is do exactly the same for some type of synth that you have. For example, I'll create a MIDI track and copy an existing chord progression here. I'll load up Diva because it's my favorite synth. Just load up some type of a chord patch. Or you know what, let's choose this arpeggio here. Yeah, just like has the ARP enabled. Otherwise it would be just a chord. So what I'll do is then open up this panel, hit configure, and click on those parameters that I've just mentioned. We got the cutoff, the decay. You can also click the sustain, release, decay, sustain, release. And sometimes what gives you some extra level of control is the envelope knob here, envelope amount. And you can see that it's linked, the cutoff is linked to envelope 2 in this particular patch, meaning that this is our filter section. I'll just click frequency to keep it really simple, right? You don't have to click through all these knobs that I just did. Even if you just have the frequency, that's mostly enough. And I'll create an automation to where it opens up right before the warm-up section. I'll play it from here. You see, you don't necessarily need to use the sample. If you have a synth, this is, I would say, even better because it allows you to take control over individual parameters from within that synth to really open it up. And using the default parameters here is one way, using some kind of a reverb or delay automation is another way. During the warm-up phase, that's another 16 bars. You can see that's where I blend in the drums. The more this filter opens up here, the more you start hearing them. This is the drums group over here. See, the filter opens up and the black hole reverb automation also takes place. Tension, tension, tension. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the filter entirely opens up, whereas the black hole reverb is suddenly cut down. And just as a little bonus tip, I made sure to take away the hi-hats for a fourth, so a quarter note, and just leave in that final clap. And the clap has a bit of extra reverb automation. You see that on the drums group, I automated the reverb into the black hole, so that last clap functions like an impact. Rather than using transition sounds, you emphasize the last clap of the rhythm to transition into the, the main section. Pay attention to the last clap. It's like shh. It's almost like a transition effect in and of itself. And the percussion also, as you can see, blended away for exactly 1/4 note to leave more space for that final little clap, that swoosh. If you want, you can add some kind of a riser during this section over here, some drum build or some kind of a white noise sweep. But I, again, prefer to do the most of the work with the tracks that I already have with automation before using some kind of a sample or riser or snare build or whatever. Because this is a more classy way to do it. I feel like it just sounds more authentic to you and it makes you a better producer, I would say. To learn how to create these tension sweeps using automation and the tracks that you already have inside of your project instead of just cluttering more and more on top. So yeah, in the warm-up, we also tease our bass line. And in this phase, it doesn't have a lot of weight. So you see, like you can hear it, but it doesn't have a lot of sub. That's because there's an auto filter cutting out the lows. And on the master channel, there's also a low cut cutting out the entire low end frequency of the entire track, just to make sure that there's no low end before the drop hits. You can just hear silhouettes of the bass line, but when the drop hits, the full bass line is reintroduced. Yeah. Put that together. Freaking nice. And very important thing for the warm-up phase is that you utilize delay, particularly feedback. I know there's producers like Kasper Koman who also use a lot of delay feedback automation during their warm-up and build-up phases to create tension. And this is just another way of creating tension without using any type of riser. See on the pads group, I have an instance of color copy, which I love using for these long dub delay type delays. And if I just solo the pads group, for example, see the mix is automated here. And that carries on throughout the warm-up. And the regen is the feedback, what determines how long the delay is being played. I mean, if you crank up the feedback, it almost starts to sound like an entirely unique sound. But the wonderful thing about this is that it's not. It's using the sounds that you already have inside of your session to create a unique riser synth, you can say. By utilizing the delay feedback, and in this case, I just automated the mix knob to bring in that delay during the warm-up phase on the entire pads group. And I think I also did the same for the synth. So you see the melody group, which contains all these little call and response type melodies and the guitar. They also have an instance of color copy on top. And that instance of color copy is being automated into the warm-up section. So pay attention to how it sounds here. So we're using elements from the build-up to transition into the warm-up phase. And I think at some point I actually turned off the automation just to make sure that there's nothing still happening in the main section. Yeah, in the main section, you usually don't want to have any of those reverb or delay tails to create the most amount of contrast between the warm-up and the drop, the tension and the release. I find that having a lot of automation here and then cutting that automation here is very useful. However, sometimes this is very individual and depends on every single track. It helps to have some elements fade into the chorus, fade into the drop. So if you have, for example, some kind of a synth that would play here, you can use some delay feedback automation to kind of swell it into the drop. So that's very individual and depends entirely on what type of a track you're going for. If you want to see this technique that I've just mentioned, you can watch this arrangement video somewhere in the top corner where I've done exactly that. Reverb automation on drums during the warm-up phase, I've already mentioned that. And in the chorus, aka the drop, aka the release, is where you fully bring back all the energy in the drums, meaning that there's no filter action going on them. Bass line gets its full weight back. There's no filter on the bass line, nothing cutting out the lows or the highs. The delay and feedback back to zero, or at least a very low amount, so it's barely audible to create that contrast. And you don't have to, you can introduce a new element of surprise if you'd like. For example, in this case, I introduced a dub chord that comes in with the drop. And this was created with a Microfreak, my favorite little synthesizer. Just to give the drop a bit more flavor melodically, just instead of cutting out all the atmospheres, synths, at least have like one melodic element to still keep it interesting. Sometimes I know a lot of producers who just chuck in a bunch of ethnic sounds here, like a duduk or something that's like completely flashes you in the release and the drop, something that you wouldn't expect. But in this case, I wanted to keep it really chill and subtle. I'm going to play the track for you once again, starting from, let's say, a couple bars before the cooldown section plays. And I want you to follow along, maybe open up the chart and see what's happening. So enjoy. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit that like and subscribe button. Check out my site, LotusTunes.com, where I have a bunch of high-quality sounds, courses, and I'm going to walk you through the entire project file on my Patreon. I've decided to go for a full entire walkthrough, so once that's up, I'll put a link to that in the description below as well. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.